Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anne-Marie Butler. I'm the President of the Agricultural Science Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event this morning, Multi-Species Swards, Environmental Sward Production and Animal Performance Benefits. We are delighted that so many can join us on this Wednesday morning. I am here in Kilkenny. The rain has finally stopped and a blue sky emerging, so hopefully the weather is good where you are. ASA are delighted this morning to be able to bring you this event. We would have hoped to all be back to a face-to-face environment when this event was originally proposed to me by Professor Tommy Boland, but certainly we make the best of what we have, and we look forward to getting back to face-to-face as the vaccine continues to roll and people begin to emerge back out to meet each other. The event today is a very timely event, and ASA is delighted to bring you the latest in scientific developments, research and on-farm production. We're delighted this morning to have a tremendous panel of speakers with you, all of whom won't need any introduction, but we're delighted to have them. Dr. John Finn from Teagasc and Johnstone Castle, Dr. Helen Sheridan from the University College Dublin School of Agriculture, and Professor Tommy Boland, also from UCD School of Agriculture, and who is an ASA Council member. We thank them for their time, and we thank them for the most valuable production of videos they had over the last couple of weeks, which have encouraged and generated great engagement across social media. Events like today are not possible without our sponsors, so I would like to sincerely thank Germalin for their support, and to welcome Dr. Mary McAvoy, who will host and chair our moderated session today, and to thank Mary for her support of ASA and her colleagues. ASA continues to support our members. To those of you who are members, I thank you for your membership. If you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. If you're not an ASA member, we were only too happy to welcome you, so please do get in contact with us, and we can share the benefits of ASA with you and certainly guarantee a warm welcome and a very friendly scientific environment. It would be remiss of me not to thank Barbara McGoldrick, who is in our office, our staff member. Barbara has been instrumental in getting us to today, but certainly in the production of our videos. So thank you to Barbara, and for keeping law and order today on the webinar and to keep us on our way. Q&A is open from the beginning, so please do post your questions. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so questions can come in right throughout. So I would ask you to enjoy. Certainly get involved, and hopefully today there is something for everybody to take from it. Before I hand to Mary, we're just going to play a very short video now from our sponsor.
Great advice makes a difference. The grass and forage experts. Germinal, sowing future seeds.
I'd like to thank the ASA for giving us the opportunity to sponsor this event. There's huge interest in multi-species, and it's going to be very important, I think, for the future of the Irish livestock industry. We have some great speakers here, and on the webinar today, the amount of information that you will be able to garner from this will be hugely valuable to you, whether you're thinking of sowing them yourself or maybe advising farmers on the use of them. The questions and answer session is going to be very important, and I think there's going to be huge value in that. So please do put your questions and answers in through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we will get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. So look, without further ado, I will introduce John Finn. So Dr. John Finn is a researcher on biodiversity and farmland ecology based at Teagasc Environmental Research Centre at Johnstone Castle in County Wexford. John graduated from University College Cork with a PhD in community ecology. He lectured and researched at UCC and University of Reading before joining Teagasc in 2002. John's research interests include multi-species grassland mixtures, research and results-based approaches for ecosystem services, high nature value farming systems, and effective actions for biodiversity restoration in intensively farmed landscapes. John, as you are all well aware, has been researching multi-species mixtures since joining Teagasc. And I think, to be fair to John, he was probably talking about multi-species long before most of us were even aware of what they were. So John's research is focusing on investigating the yield of multi-species. He's looking at drought resistance and environmental benefits. And more recently, he has overseen the introduction of multi-species mixtures into the livestock trials at Johnstone Castle Research Centre. And that's going to be hugely valuable in terms of feeding information into the performance of multi-species in animal grazing systems. So with that, John, I'd like to hand over to you and welcome you to the webinar this morning.
Thanks very much, Mary. So can I just check that that's appearing okay there? So can you see my first slide?
Yeah, John, we can see
Okay,
that.
great. Okay, thank you. So thank you, Mary, again, and many thanks to ASA for the opportunity to present this morning. Just want to acknowledge the contribution of several of our co-authors with some of the selected highlights that I want to show this morning. I'm feeling very old now. I haven't been told that I've been working at this for so long, but it probably reflects why there's so many co-authors there to thank over the years as well. So for the next 15 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is give a short overview of some of the effects of mixtures on yield and weeds and some of our key experiments on this. We'd like to talk about how do lower nitrogen mixture yields compare with higher nitrogen grass monoculture yields. A key bit of work that we've been doing in recent years is looking at, can mixtures improve the resilience of grassland production to drought? And then just a quick insight into some of the next steps and plans that we have for the future. So, in almost 18 years ago or so, we started work on mixture yields with a European project. And the question there was, can mixtures improve yield compared to monocultures? The perceived wisdom at the time was that there would always be a monoculture that's best adapted to the prevailing conditions. And that if you could just pick the right monoculture, that would always provide the maximum yield, especially under conditions where you had plenty of nitrogen available. So we were testing that question at the time and also wanted to look at, well, how would this contrast or potential contrast in performance between mixtures and monocultures vary across multiple environmental conditions? Would we expect the same pattern across multiple types of soil and environment and so on? So to test this, we were looking at mixtures in the agrodiversity experiment, which was conducted from 2003 to 2005. So if we look at this map here on the right-hand side, you can see that this was an experiment where we conducted the exact same trial across areas that varied as much as from Iceland and Norway right down to Sardinia in Italy. So a very exciting project with 31 sites, 17 countries, including Canada, and over 930 plots scattered across these various field sites. So we were using agronomic species, and we were testing whether two grasses and two legumes, and we were testing whether monocultures of two grasses and two legumes, how they performed compared to 4 species combinations of those two grasses and two legumes. What was very new at the time was that we were experimentally varying the evenness at sowing of the different combinations. So most people were looking at monocultures versus mixtures and looking at the equiproportional contribution, whereas we were also looking at varying evenness. So we had 70% of each of the species dominating, and then more equitable mixtures with 40 of 2 species and 10 of the other 2, and cycling through all the various combinations. So again, experimentally varying evenness of the mixtures. A very important part of our work compared to other work on mixtures before that is that we're very interested in strategic selection of the species. We're not just randomly compiling species, we're selecting them for digestibility, production, and interactions that are meaningful in a grassland context. So in this experiment, we were choosing 2 grasses because of their digestibility and yield, and 2 legumes because of their contribution of nitrogen through fixed symbiotic nitrogen. And we also had fast-growing species that the idea was that they would establish quickly in the sward and prevent weed invasion, and then more slower growing species that would establish better over time once that initial problem with weeds was withstood by the fast-growing species. So again, this strategic selection of species was quite important. So looking at the data, across this axis, we see the sites listed in order from 1 to 31. The first thing to notice is that there was a huge variation in yield as we go across all of the sites, which is to be expected when you think about some highly productive sites going to the extremes of Iceland and Sardinia, which are either very cold or very dry. So in each of these sites, what we're looking at is the mixtures, so highlighted in red, represented in the little circles. We're also looking at the best performing monoculture represented by this short bar, and also the average of the monocultures represented by the gray square. So in this particular example, we can see that all 11 combinations of the mixtures, the 11 different types of evenness, each of them performed better, not just than the average of the 4 monoculture yields, but in terms of the best monoculture yield. So looking across all 31 sites, the asterisks at the top here indicate those sites where the mixtures performed better than the best monoculture. So the majority of sites, it indicated this. And even at sites that didn't show where the mixtures were better than the best monoculture, you can see that they're very competitive and very close to it, with only one or two examples, such as here, where the majority of the mixtures performed worse than the best monoculture. And even then, they were exceeding the performance of the average monocultures. So this is quite unexpected. We really did not expect such a strong mixture signal from this experiment. And looking at a summary over all of the sites and plots, we see that there was 98 of the mixture plots, 98% of all of these mixture plots were better than the average monoculture, and 65% of the mixture plots were better than the best monoculture. And on average, there was about a 20% yield advantage in the mixtures compared to the best monoculture. So of course, we don't measure forage production through yield alone, and resistance to weed invasion is another very important property of grasslands. In the same experiment, we also looked at resistance to weed pressure by comparing yield and weed proportion in yield in year 1, year 2, year 3. And here we're comparing it in the average of the monocultures versus the average of the mixtures. So these red bars here represent what proportion of yield was represented by weeds. So in the first year, we can see that the monocultures on average had about 15% weeds, whereas the mixtures on average had about 4% weeds. And as we jump to year 3, we see that the weed proportion in the monocultures has jumped to about 32%, whereas the mixtures are remarkably consistent in year 1, 2, and 3 in keeping that weed biomass below 4%. And this is an extremely important, but also a common property that we see in mixture experiments, that they're highly resistant to weed pressure. So combining the results from these two slides, we see that the mixtures are providing not only greater yield, but are also ensuring that that yield is composed of the species that we sowed and are resisting weed pressure. And this is quite important in mixtures where you can't apply a post-emergent spray. So following this work, we did a couple of other experiments, but I think the next big idea that we were tackling was, can mixtures provide insurance against drought? So I remember when we first started this work, it was actually quite a giggle for some people, and we were quite bemused by it ourselves, that we would be looking at drought in Ireland. But of course, since then we've had reminders of why this is an important issue everywhere, including Ireland, and is not declining in importance, and that's for sure. So there's long been an assumption that diversity in natural ecosystems, but also in agricultural ecosystems, provides a benefit in withstanding pressures from environmental disturbances. But it's actually quite remarkable how rarely this idea has been tested, and especially in agronomic productive grasslands that are more intensively managed. There's been quite a bit of work in semi-natural grasslands, but very little on the kind of grasslands for agricultural production in intensive situations. So as part of the EU animal change experiment back in 2013 and 14, we had 2 sites in Ireland and Switzerland testing this idea about mixture diversity and its resilience to drought. So here you can see the kind of drought shelters that we established with the rain-fed control situation and the droughted performance here in a 3 meter by 5 meter rain-out shelter. This is an example of those shelters in the field. We had 1, 2, and 4 species plots, or mixtures and plots. And we conducted in the middle of the season, we had 1/2 of each plot, which had a 9-week experimental drought applied. And the species that we selected, again, were strategically selected to test their ability to resist drought. So in this case, we were selecting shallow rooting and deep rooting species. And again, we had the non-fixing grass and chicory as a herb, but also the nitrogen fixing red and white clover. Now, these plots received 150 kgs of nitrogen per year in Ireland and 200 kgs per year in the Swiss sites. And they were managed by mowing 5 or 6 times per year. So what do we find? So taking the Irish example in Wexford, we see that as species richness increased from 1 to 2 to 4 species, these yields, which were across 3 harvests in the year, including the drought. So we took the harvest immediately before drought, the harvest during drought, and the harvest. The harvest. Each point represents the harvest before, during, and after drought. So it represents that control situation, the ability of the community to resist drought, and the recovery of the community to drought. And we did this for the monocultures, the 2 species plots, and the 4 species plots across 2 years. So what you see here is that for these selected harvests, averaged over time, there's an increase in yield as species richness increases. And not only is there an increase in yield, there's also a reduction in yield variability, which is classic yield stability. Looking at the Swiss site, we see the exact same pattern, and it's more pronounced. Again, this increase in yield as species richness increases, and a reduction in yield variation as richness increases. So this is under the rain-fed control situation. What happened under drought? So here we see more or less the exact same pattern. You see a general depression of yield, as you would expect, because there has been an environmental disturbance. But the same pattern pertains, that we see that the yield increases and the variability decreases. And again, the yield increases and variability decreases. And that pattern that we see under the rain-fed control maintains under drought. So quite an important finding, showing that mixtures can maintain yield stability. And interestingly, we see that the mixture performance under drought equals the monoculture performance under rain-fed conditions. And in the Swiss site, that was one better, where the mixture performance under drought exceeded the average monoculture performance under rain-fed conditions. And again, showing that these mixtures have the ability to be a mitigation for drought and grassland production exposed to this environmental disturbance and severe weather event. So looking at this example with 4 species, and we were immediately saying, well, have we exhausted the potential of these mixtures to provide resilience to drought? What happens if we increase it to 6 species? And this was our next experiment, where this time we're including 2 grasses, 2 herbs, and 2 legumes. And we've got monoculture. So this represents the experimental design as a ternary layout. So we've got, this would be a monoculture of one functional group, monoculture of another functional group, and a monoculture of another functional group, grass, legume, herb. This is the 50-50 combinations of them. And then in the interior, we've got the equiproportional mixture of 3 functional groups, grass, legume, herb, and then various evenness communities of those. So we're looking at grasses, legumes, and herbs, and mixing them in different proportions with the equiproportional plot looking something like that. So these are sown, harvested 7 times a year, and we also had climatic treatment of drought. Again, testing in more detail the way in which mixtures can perform when we increase the species richness, and can that effect pertain under drought as well. So the plots look something like this, and we had the usual harvesting and sorting that goes on with these kinds of experiments. And the results look like this. So I might just take a moment to talk through what this ternary diagram here indicates. So this is the average annual yield over 2 years. And what we have here at the corner point is the average of the 2 legume monocultures, the red and white clover. So it's saying that the functional group here, the color of that, which is between 10.5 and 11, indicated by this density plot of colors. So the more dense, the higher, the more green the color, the higher the yield, varying from about 8.5 right up to 12.5 kgs. So there's quite a spread of yield across this ternary diagram, with the lowest being in the herb functional group, intermediate and the pretty equal performance in the grass and legumes. But what we see is that when we mix the species in this interior space, you see this very strong mixing effect, whereby these mixtures are considerably exceeding the performance of the monocultures, indicating this really strong mixing effect. And that's not just due to mixing legumes and grasses, which we know have a positive effect, but also due to the herbs. So the herbs are bringing something extra to the party. So this general effect, whereby mixing the functional groups in 6 species communities, is also repeated and is even stronger under drought. And again, is showing that the annual yields of drought are more resilient when we have mixture communities compared to the monoculture communities, which declined quite considerably. So again, repeating somewhat this in a similar way to the pattern that we saw in the 4-species experiment, this yield stability effect is pertaining under drought again. So looking at the yields, we see that the equiproportional mixture here is equivalent to almost 12 tons. The equiproportional mixture under drought is just over 10.5 tons. And interestingly, these were all at 150 kgs of nitrogen in each of these sets of plots. And the performance of the 300 kg nitrogen lowly perennial monoculture was about 10.5 tons. So we see that over most of the design space of the mixtures, the performance of them is at 150 kgs of nitrogen is exceeding the yields of the annual yield of lowly perennial with twice the fertilizer application. Again, showing the nitrogen saving potential and nitrogen replacement value of the mixtures. Final couple of slides, Chair. So looking at the next thing we wanted to look at was nitrous oxide emissions from these plots, and some great work by, sorry, I should say that that previous work was conducted by Guylaine Grange, a PhD student funded by Teagasc. So another Walsh scholar funded by Teagasc is Saoirse Cummins, whose work has been focused on these little bits in the plots that you can see, which are static chambers measuring nitrous oxide emissions. So Saoirse's work is showing that, again, in the same type of design where we've got the grasses, the legumes, and the herbs, we see these really strong mixture effects on nitrous oxide emissions intensity. So this is nitrous oxide emissions per unit of nitrogen yield in the dry matter. So very, very strong effects on nitrous oxide emissions, with the mixtures being significantly lower than the either the grass lowly perennial at 150 kgs of nitrogen, and the lowly perennial at 300 kgs of nitrogen was 10 units, which is double this scale. So completely off the scale in terms of nitrous oxide emissions intensity. So there's a real value, and this is something that we want to focus on more in looking at nitrous oxide emissions in these mixtures. Okay, so to conclude, we see that diversity matters and that the strategic selection of species is important for mixture design. Mixtures can benefit a wide range of grassland properties, including yields, weed resistance, protein self-sufficiency, which I didn't cover here, nitrogen efficiency, yield stability under drought, and N2O emissions intensity. Underpinning a lot of these is that the legume percentage is crucial to underpin the mixture benefits. Last slide. Looking briefly to the future, we are focusing more on taking these results from agronomic plots into livestock grazing trials, and we're doing that at Johnstown and various other Teagasc sites at the moment. We're interested in the legacy effects, and Guylaine's work is continuing that to see what is the residual soil fertility in a rotation if we were to have if we were to put a grassland lay into a rotation, what residual soil fertility can be passed on to the next crop in a series of rotations. Soil carbon sequestration and their how they are affected by mixtures will become increasingly important. And we're also interested in what is the role of low nitrogen multi-species mixtures in contributing forage for anaerobic co-digestion. Okay, you can see more on these and hear more about the papers and read more about the papers that we've published at this at my blog. And thank you very much, and thanks again to ASA for the opportunity to present our research. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for a very interesting presentation. And I think Barbara's going to try to share a video now from Johnstown Castle. Unfortunately, with the times we're in, I think we would have all liked to be on site here today and maybe see some of these multi-species
for the last 15 years.
Look at the video instead.
Really keen on looking at multi-species mixtures. We've started by looking at grass and legume combinations, and since then we've moved on to looking at grass, legume and herb combinations and trying to pinpoint what's the additional benefit of adding herbs into the mix. We know that there's benefits from combining grasses and legumes through that transfer of symbiotically fixed nitrogen into the system, getting free nitrogen, so to speak. But what's the additional benefit of the herbs? So it seems that there's a number of pathways that the herbs can have a positive impact. First of all, they can help reduce weed suppression or improve weed suppression. They can also act as anthelmintic, that there's positive effects of the herbs in reducing parasite burdens in animals. And thirdly, they can also act to reduce the nitrogen excretion in animals, or they act as a diuretic, the plantain in particular, and can increase the volume of urine excreted by the animal, thereby reducing the concentration of nitrogen in the urine, which is quite an important source of greenhouse gas emissions. So in one of our most recent experiments, a PhD student with Trinity College, supervised by Caroline Brophy, and myself here at Johnstown Castle, Guylaine Grange, has been looking at combinations of 2 species of grass, 2 species of herb, and 2 species of legumes. So we've been looking at perennial ryegrass, timothy, red and white clover, chicory, and plantain. And Guylaine's work has been focusing an awful lot on what are the optimal percentage contributions of each of these groups to optimize yield, forage quality, drought resistance, and also legacy effects. So looking at the yields, it's quite clear that there are very different types of effects on yields when we look at grasses alone, herbs alone, and legumes alone, and very strong synergistic effects on all of these things: drought, yield, forage quality, total nitrogen, and legacy effects when we combine them together. The legacy effect is describing the effect of the preceding crop, which can vary in terms of its percentage of grasses, legumes, and herbs, on the subsequent crop. And this allows us to use a model crop to look at how are the manipulations of the proportions of grasses, legumes, and herbs affecting properties that affect soil health, soil fertility, and the transfer of nutrients from one phase in a rotation, for example, through the soil into the next phase of a rotation. So we've been doing this by looking at 10-metre plots and growing them under different types of vegetation for 2 years, then rotivating a part of that plot, reseeding with the same monoculture, in this case of Italian ryegrass, and tracking the effects of the preceding effects on soil through the growth of the subsequent crop of Italian ryegrass monoculture. So it's clear that we're facing into a policy environment where there's going to be extremely strong pressure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and agricultural products. So as part of that, we're comparing some of our plots which have 150 kgs of nitrogen with lowly and perennial monoculture, which is 300 kgs of nitrogen applied. And so long as we keep the legume proportion above 20%, we're finding almost universally that any mixture combination is exceeding the performance of the 300 kg lowly and perennial ryegrass. So this is quite impressive in terms of yield production, but it's not just yield production. We've also been using static chambers in the field to look at nitrous oxide emissions. And when we look at nitrous oxide emissions intensity, we also see that this is extremely high in the 300 kgs nitrogen lowly and perennial ryegrass, moderate in the 150 kgs lowly and perennial monoculture, but is lower again in the multi-species mixtures. So all in all, this is really pointing towards the potential for these multi-species mixtures to provide a more environmentally sustainable grassland production system.
And so next up we have Dr. Helen Sheridan. Helen is a lecturer in agricultural ecology and agri-environmental policy, and she's also the director of the Bachelor of Agricultural Science, Agri-Environmental Sciences in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD. Helen comes from a dry stock farm in County Longford, and she has a Bachelor of Agricultural Science in Agri-Environmental Science and also a PhD in Agricultural Ecology. Her primary research interests are the potential of multi-species swards to enhance agri-environmental sustainability, the development and monitoring of agri-environmental measures, and the classification and management of farmland habitats and associated biodiversity. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Mary, and thank you very much to ASA for giving me the opportunity to present here today. I'll just share my screen with you there. Okay, so I want to take you through some of the highlights, I suppose, of our work on multi-species swards to date in terms of sward performance and also the wider environmental benefits of them. And while I'm the person presenting today, I'd also like to acknowledge all of those listed on this slide for all of their hard work. And certainly it's been through them and their work that these results have been possible. John has talked about in quite a bit of detail there about the selection, the strategic selection of species, and that's hugely important. And I mean, just to outline at the start that you know, the swards we're talking about are comprised of species that have been selected for their agronomic potential largely. And, you know, it's how those different species grown together in a mixture can use resources both above and below ground and in time and space maybe more efficiently than monocultures can do so. So I'm going to take you through some of our work looking at that. And I suppose our story in UCD with multi-species swards begins really with the Smartgrass project, which was funded by the Department of Agriculture back in 2012. So as part of this, we established a large-scale plot experiment that consisted of 112 plots. And within that, we were looking at different species coming from different functional groups of plants, so grasses, legumes, and forage herbs. We had up to 9 species in some plots, so the maximally diverse sward would have consisted of perennial ryegrass, timothy, cocksfoot, red clover, white clover, birdsfoot trefoil, chicory, plantain, and yarrow. But we had different combinations of those species down to monocultures. And those swards would have received different levels of nitrogen inputs, so ranging from 0 to 135 kgN per hectare per year. And then we compared those to what we regarded as our conventional controls, which were perennial ryegrass monocultures receiving 250 kg of nitrogen per hectare per year. So, you know, we harvested those, taking dry matter yields, and also sorted to look at the composition or the contribution of individual species to that dry matter over time. So just to show some of the results here, and these are coming, these ones from Connie Grace's work. So what we're showing here is on the x-axis, the increasing nitrogen input into the different swards, ranging from 0 to 135 kgN, and then we're showing kilograms of dry matter per hectare on the y-axis. The different coloured lines represent the different mixtures we're looking at, and they're presented as the sowing ratio, if you like, from grass, legume, and herb, and they're always presented in that order. So for example, the 55-35-10 mix that you see there was sown to be 55% grass, 35% legume, and 10% herb. And the dotted black line that you see is the yield over 2 years from our perennial ryegrass swards receiving 250 kgN per hectare per year. And what's really interesting, I think, is that you can see even when a number of our mixtures are receiving 0 nitrogen input, they're still performing really well in terms of dry matter yield when compared to that the yield from the ryegrass swards. And when they receive up to 90 kgN, then they start to outperform the perennial ryegrass swards. Looking at that through the year, through the growing season, and these are based on results from 2 years data here. So we can see that in the spring, even though we're highly dependent on the legume content of the multi-species swards to drive performance, we can see that yields weren't slowed up relative to the perennial ryegrass swards in the spring. And I guess this probably relates to how we applied our nitrogen, in that we're front loading the early part of the year, our nitrogen inputs into those swards. But again, we can see that a number of our mixtures here are performing as well as or better than the ryegrass monoculture in springtime in terms of their dry matter yields. In summer, ryegrass certainly comes into its own. You can see that its yields are going up there, and it's outperforming many of the mixtures. However, 2 of them are still performing higher than the ryegrass monoculture. So that would be the 55-35-10 mix, and also I think the 60-20-20 mix that we use there. And then in autumn, again, you see the yield from the ryegrass drop back, but a number again of our mixtures are still performing really well in the autumn time. And you can see that, you know, that they're even at 0 in that yield has stayed up into the end of the year due to the legume content, which is hugely important. So what is that nitrogen application doing, I suppose, in terms of the composition of that dry matter yield? So how does it affect the individual species? And I've been particularly interested in this and tracking how that changes. So when we sow a mix, it can look very different to how it'll look even in 6 months' time, depending on the fertilizer that's going into it. So if you look at the highlighted line there, which was a mix zone with 60% legume, you'll see that when we looked at the dry matter yield from that, 28% of it was coming from the grass component and 70% from the legume component, at 0 nitrogen being applied to those swards. But when we increased that nitrogen input to 135 kgN, we're switching where that dry matter is coming from. So we're increasing the proportion of it coming from the grasses and decreasing the proportion coming from the legumes. Similarly, we see in this graph with the 55-35-10 mix, a similar thing. We increase the proportion of dry matter coming from the grass component, but decreasing the proportion coming from the legume component as we increase the fertilizer nitrogen input. In the last graph that I showed there, we didn't see any yield benefit, in fact, of adding in that additional 135 kgN. Here we do, but I guess it's up to individual farmers whether they're going to actually need that increased yield from their swards or not. Species persistence is something that we need to understand better. We did track, as I say, what was happening to the different species and their composition, or their contribution rather, to dry matter yield over time. And we did that in a replicated experiment where we had a complex mix and a simple mix, and where so that was a 9 species mix and a 6 species mix. And then we looked at them under simulated grazing conditions, so harvesting via cutting 8 times over the grazing season versus grazing, and what impact that had on species. So here we have just cocksfoot, and the first column shows the proportion of the mix it was sown at, but we can see how different species will respond to either cutting or grazing over time. And certainly it appears that cocksfoot certainly likes cutting conditions more than grazing. However, it did seem to, over 3 years that we looked at this, it did remain in the sward and was persistent within the sward. Timothy, on the other hand, does seem to decrease in abundance over time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're left with a gap in your sward, because other species may fill that gap over time. And similarly, then looking in a little detail at some of the herb species, rib-earth plantain certainly seems to respond better to grazing conditions rather than cutting conditions, whereas we see the opposite happening with chicory. So it is going to vary, really, I think is what we can say, between cutting and grazing conditions. We are likely, I suppose, to see a decrease in the herb component over time. But as I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be left with a gappy sward. It just means you will have more grass and legume in your sward. We were interested also in the wider kind of environmental benefits, and particularly biodiversity, associated with these kind of more botanically diverse swards. And here we're talking about these swards that are, they have been sown for their production potential. We're not talking about species rich or semi-natural swards. But what we're seeing here in terms of earthworms is that when we add legumes into the mix, you see a very significant increase in the biomass of earthworm recorded within those plots. And this is a relationship between earthworms and legumes that's long been known, according to my colleague, Professor Olaf Schmidt. That's well understood. When we look at abundance of earthworms, you see similar similar relationship happening there. We also do get a response though in terms of the biomass of the earthworms to the herb component as well. In addition, looking at the species richness across the three major functional groups of earthworms, we're seeing that positive response to including legumes within the swards as well. And that's hugely beneficial in terms of all of the activities that earthworms engage in, obviously. In a separate study, we looked at 4 different sward types, so a 9-species mix of perennial ryegrass and white clover receiving 90 kgN, perennial ryegrass receiving 250 kgN, ryegrass receiving 90, and then a 6-species mix, or a simple mix. And we see in those, when we looked at earthworm activity as indicated by the number of surface casts that were counted, we see that they're lowest always in the ryegrass monocultures. So all of the other sward types had significantly greater earthworms casts recorded on the surface. And similarly, we're finding that water infiltration rates tends to be lowest in our monoculture swards as well. So when you look at the two together, we found a very significant positive relationship between the water infiltration rates and the surface cast numbers of earthworms found in our plots. In terms of wider invertebrate abundance, we're looking here at parasitoid wasps. You might say, why? Well, parasitoids parasitize other organisms, so therefore they're a very good indicator of wider biodiversity, invertebrate biodiversity. And remember, while climate change, we focused a lot of attention on that, and rightly so, we also have a biodiversity crisis here in Ireland as well that's recognised at this stage. So, we need to ensure that our swards are supporting wider biodiversity. And we're seeing here with our legume and herb included in the swards, we're getting a positive response in terms of the parasitoid wasps, but also in terms of beetles as well, beetle abundance within them. So where has that brought us? Well, really based on the results and the animal performance results, which Tommy will talk about in a few minutes, we have established the UCD long-term grazing platform. And this has really been down to the foresight and vision, I suppose, of our head of school, Professor Alex Evans. We want to have this long-term site where we can look at and measure and try and address many of the major challenges that are facing ruminant agriculture in Ireland, but also elsewhere. And that site is now part of the Global Farm Platform, which is a network of sites globally that are working towards enhancing the sustainability of ruminant production systems. Our first project on that is Smart Sward, funded by the Department of Agriculture again, and we're working with all of these partners listed here. So within that, we have 3 farmlets that were established in 2019. They're each 8 hectares in size. So we have ryegrass receiving 205 kgN per hectare per year, perennial ryegrass and white clover, and then one of our best performing multi-species swards. So ryegrass, timothy, white clover, red clover, chicory, and plantain. And those last 2 sward types are both receiving 90 kgN. And we're grazing that under a calf to beef dairy calf to beef system at a stocking rate of 2.5 livestock units per hectare. So this is just preliminary results here in terms of our yields from the different farmlets. This is based on 2020 data, and we can see that while there wasn't a huge difference in terms of yields, the multi-species swards are performing better and in terms of dry matter yield production. But also the yields, it's important to recognize that those yields coming from the ryegrass and white clover and the multi-species swards are coming with less than half the levels of applied nitrogen that are required to produce the yield of the ryegrass monoculture that we're seeing here. So we're also working on a project, Marie Curie funded project with Devonish, and University of Wageningen. It's heartland and it's based on the lands at Delft. And there we have 4 sward types. So perennial ryegrass sward again, permanent pasture in this case, a 6-species mix, and then a more species-rich multi-species mix is 12 species in this instance. And our multi-species swards here are receiving 70 kgN versus 170 going on the perennial ryegrass swards, and these are being co-grazed by cattle and sheep. And just to give a taster of some of the outputs from last year, this is coming from Jane Shackleton's work here, we're seeing again that our multi-species sward types, our 6 species and our 12 species, are outperforming the other sward types in terms of their dry matter yields, despite the fact that they're receiving 100 kg less nitrogen input per hectare per year than the perennial ryegrass monoculture. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that for now, and Tommy will be dealing with the animal performance from those studies.
Thanks very much, Helen. Helen, I'll just ask you to stop sharing, and Barbara is going to put up a video from the UCD research firm at Lyons Estate. So just to ask everyone, we have a number of questions coming in through the Q&A section there, so please put your questions in. I think we'll have a really good opportunity when we have Helen, Tommy and John on the webinar here to get a good insight and get a chance to answer any of those questions that you have.
Sorry, this just isn't letting me stop share here. Just not.
Yeah, I think video's coming up here now. Thank you.
On the long-term grazing platform, we're investigating 3 sward types: a perennial ryegrass monoculture, perennial ryegrass and white clover, and then a 6-species multi-species sward, which is comprised of perennial ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, chicory and plantain. Data from our first year is showing that dry matter production from our multi-species swards is equivalent to that of the perennial ryegrass swards, although they're only receiving half the level of applied nitrogen per hectare. In addition, we have been looking at the composition of that dry matter and how the different species are contributing to it, and also what level of weed encroachment there is into the swards. And so far, we haven't found any significant problems with weed encroachment into our multi-species swards. In addition to the large-scale paddock experiment, we also have a plot experiment where we're looking at the impacts of management in terms of the rotation length, but also the post-grazing sward height and how that will impact on species' ability to contribute to dry matter, but also their persistence over time. And while that's a cutting experiment, we believe it will give us really good insight into these management factors for grazing systems.
The long-term grazing platform is a globally unique facility where we have 12 hydrologically isolated paddocks. This allows us to collect all the water which drains from these areas, measure its volume and also analyse it for its nutrient content. At the moment, these 12 hydrologically isolated paddocks are divided across 3 different grazing treatments. We have a perennial ryegrass monoculture sward, we have a perennial ryegrass plus white clover sward, and we have a 6-species multi-species sward. The 6 species contained in the multi-species sward are chicory, plantain, red clover, white clover, timothy, and perennial ryegrass. In our first year of animal performance studies conducted in 2020, the animals grazing both the perennial ryegrass and white clover sward and the multi-species sward were finished approximately 20 days earlier than the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass monoculture sward. Also, when the calves were housed over their first winter and fed silage produced from these different sward types, the animals offered the silage produced from the multi-species sward grew to 100 grams per day faster than the animals offered the perennial ryegrass only silage. The results to date indicate that the animal performance responses we have recorded in our sheep production systems are so far being replicated in our beef cattle production systems. This offers a lot of potential for farmers and for the beef industry to meet some of the environmental challenges that they're currently facing, including reducing the input of fertilizer and nitrogen into the system, reducing the days to slaughter, which has the potential to reduce the carbon footprint of the system, and also reducing the requirement for anthelmintics to control intestinal parasites. This work is going to be repeated over the next 2 years, and we look forward to bringing you more findings from the work at UCD Lyons Farm.
Just finishing off the video there was Tommy Boland, who's our next speaker here this morning. So Professor Tommy Boland is an associate professor in ruminant nutrition in UCD's School of Agriculture and Food Science. Tommy grew up on a mixed farm in County Wexford and graduated with a Bachelor of Agricultural Science, specialised in animal science in 2001, following which he completed his PhD in 2005. Tommy is currently involved in conducting research to support sustainable ruminant production systems with interest and expertise spanning dairy, beef and sheep production systems, and a special focus on reducing methane emissions and nitrogen excretion and the use of multi-species swards. Tommy is a monthly contributor to the Irish Farming Independent. He sits on numerous national and European stakeholder advisory groups, and he is also the Programme Director of the Animal Science degree in UCD's School of Agriculture and Food Science. And Tommy was recently appointed the Adjunct Professor of Sheep Husbandry at Nassau University in New Zealand. With that, Tommy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. I'll just try to find my presentation so I can start to share. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks very much, Mary. And I'm going to speak to you now this morning about the impacts of multi-species swards on animal performance. And I think John and Helen have done a really excellent job setting the scene in terms of the agronomic and the environmental benefits of multi-species swards. But in Ireland, where 90% of our agricultural area is dedicated to grazing, it's really the impact of our multi-species swards on animal performance, which is my primary interest. And again, like John and Helen, I'd just like to acknowledge the contribution of a huge number of collaborators and colleagues in the data I'm about to present this morning. And anybody online today, if they want to hear more about our work on multi-species swards, I would provide frequent updates on Twitter, either at Palace TV or at SmartSward1, which is the Twitter account for our SmartSward project. So when I became involved in this area that I was keen to look at was, what is the impact of multi-species swards on animal performance? And, I kind of came into the experimentation phase hoping that the performance on multi-species swards wouldn't be too much less than the performance on perennial ryegrass monoculture. So that was my background and that was where I was coming from. And there's a few lessons I very quickly learned in this research. Firstly, there's no such thing as a single multi-species swards. Multi-species swards are, it's a broad umbrella term which covers a whole wide range of sward mixtures. And one paddock will vary from another paddock, and we will see variation in multi-species paddocks from one part of the year to the next. So this picture, which is on your screen now, that's a multi-species sward which was established in July 2020. And when it germinated, it was pretty much dominated by chicory, as we can see here in this image. This is the same paddock in April this year when it's been grazed by ewes and lambs, and you can see it's much more grass in the sward. So the swards themselves are dynamic. They're dynamic within year and they are dynamic between year. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we're looking at how these are grazed and how these swards are managed. Okay, so as Helen indicated, our foray into multi-species research in UCD was with the Smartgrass project. And Connie Grace was working with Helen, Bridget Lynch and myself, looking at sheep grazing 4 different sward types as part of the Smartgrass project. And I suppose to make the messaging a little bit simpler, I've color-coded the treatments throughout my presentation. So the treatments we investigated in this study were a perennial ryegrass monoculture, which is colored red in the subsequent results slides, perennial ryegrass and white clover, indicated by blue, a 6-species mixture containing chicory or containing timothy, perennial ryegrass, red clover, white clover, chicory and plantain in green, and then a 9-species mixture which contained all the species in the 6-species mixture, plus cocksfoot, greater birdsfoot trefoil and yarrow. And we stocked these swards reasonably intensively at 12.5 ewes per hectare, and all ewes were rearing 2 lambs. And again, this is the structure my results slides will follow. So basically the red text box indicates the message I'm trying to convey with the slide. So when we looked at the impact of the various sward types on lamb weaning weights, we saw that compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lamb suckling ewes which grazed a 6-species sward had a 2.5 kilo higher live weight at weaning. And in sheep production systems, essentially what that means is that these lambs were consuming more milk or a higher quality milk up until the point of weaning. And the orange horizontal line across this graph at 30 kilo mark, that was our target weaning weight within this particular production system. So all our treatments were ahead of our target. When we followed those lambs on to slaughter then, what we recorded was that the animals grazing any mixture, let that be perennial ryegrass and white clover, a 6-species or a 9-species mixture, those animals reached their target slaughter weight approximately 2 weeks earlier. And while maybe initially that doesn't sound like a huge difference, this has 2 really important impacts at farm level. Firstly, it frees up herbage on a sheep farm in August, September, October, when these animals are coming ready for slaughter, to be used to get the ewes into the correct body condition for the subsequent breeding season. And secondly, by reducing the number of days to slaughter, the lambs are on farm for a shorter period of time. Therefore, they're emitting methane for a shorter period of time. And that has the potential to reduce the footprint associated with the production of lamb meat in these particular production systems. So those animal performance results are really good and really exciting in my opinion. But I think the results we were recording in relation to the parasite burden and the requirement to use anthelmintics to treat parasites is perhaps the most exciting part to come from our sheep production studies to date. So this slide, it looks at the effect of sward type on the interval or the time lag between anthelmintic administrations to control intestinal parasites in sheep. And anybody involved in sheep production and in cattle production systems will understand the challenges we're facing in terms of the development and the persistence of anthelmintic resistance in the parasite populations we're dealing with. So what we saw when we had animals grazing a perennial ryegrass sward, we needed to treat those animals with anthelmintics about every 5 weeks to control intestinal parasites. When those animals are grazing a ryegrass and white clover sward, that interval was extended out to 6 weeks, approximately 7 weeks for animals grazing the 6-species mixture, and approximately 8 weeks for animals grazing the 9-species mixture. So over the lifetime of those lambs then in our production system, and again, this study was repeated over 2 years, we saw that compared to lambs grazing a perennial ryegrass only sward, lambs grazing a multi-species sward required 50% fewer drench administrations over their life. And again, this is a really important finding in terms of maintaining the efficacy of our anthelmintics that we currently have for controlling intestinal parasites. Each time we use an anthelmintic, we give that parasite population the opportunity to select for resistant alleles to that particular anthelmintic. So by reducing the frequency of administration of these drenches, we're slowing down the selection of those resistant alleles, and basically we're maintaining the efficacy of our drugs for longer. So despite my own interest and preference for sheep production, it's the smaller part of our livestock industry nationally, and we needed to investigate these swards under cattle systems. And Helen has indicated that we were funded as part of the Smart Sward project to look at multi-species swards, both for beef cattle and in dairy production systems. And this is the study that's currently underway on the long-term grazing platform at Lyons. So in this study, we have basically three farms in our hydrologically isolated system. These farms are stocked at 2.5 livestock units per hectare, and we're grazing them with Hereford steers from the dairy herd. So these calves come in onto the site at about 15 weeks of age and are carried through until slaughter. We have 3 treatments. Red indicates perennial ryegrass, yellow indicating perennial ryegrass and white clover, and then green indicates the multi-species swards containing the 6 species. So 2020 saw the first animals slaughtered off this treatment or off this experiment, and those animals commenced grazing in the beginning of the grazing season in 2020. So if we look at the impact of sward type on the daily live weight gain of beef steers during this finishing season or during their second season at grass, we can see compared to animals grazing a perennial ryegrass only sward, animals grazing either a multi-species sward or a perennial ryegrass and white clover sward had a 20% higher growth rate during their second season at grass. Now, I'm conscious that's only one snapshot of the production cycle. So when we look at the weight of those animals, which is indicative of their average daily gain over their entire second year on our farm, and we can see at turnout, all animals had the same live weight gain. But by the time those animals were housed, the animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass, white clover sward, or the multi-species sward were 40 kilograms heavier at the end of their second grazing season. And that resulted in those animals being finished to their target slaughter weight earlier, and they were finished 3 weeks earlier. And again, just like the lambs, that has the potential to reduce methane emissions and the period of animals, or the period of time those animals are on the farm producing methane emissions. And we're currently in the process of modeling these results to see if it is actually reducing the carbon footprint of our production systems. So there was a question popped into the Q&A section there on average daily gain of these animals. My color scheme has deserted me here for some reason, but I'll talk through this slide quickly. The first bunch of 3 columns represents the perennial ryegrass group. The blue bar and the second bunch of 3 columns represent the ryegrass, white clover, and the third bunch represent the multi-species swards. The blue columns is indicative of animal performance during their first grazing season. So these were calves that came onto the platform at 15 weeks and are still on the farm today. The brown represents animals during their first winter, and the green columns represent the current performance of the animals up until the 17th of April and on the grazing platform. And again, we can see that the animals grazing either the ryegrass, white clover, or the multi-species sward are outperforming the animals grazing the perennial ryegrass sward only. And again, our perennial ryegrass treatment is in line or ahead of the targets we would like to see for this type of animal in this type of pasture-based production system. The next piece of work I want to discuss briefly is a cattle and sheep co-grazing study which we're carrying out and involved with in collaboration with Devonish on the lands at Doubt in County Meath. And this is part of the Heartland Marie Curie ITN project, which is also involves collaborators in Wageningen. And you know, it's well established, maybe it's been a little bit overlooked in recent years, that grazing cattle and sheep together in the same field at the same time has multiple benefits in terms of enhancing animal performance, grass utilization, and reducing parasite burdens. So we're looking at 4 treatments in this particular study. A perennial ryegrass sward, a PP in blue represents old permanent pasture. Again, we have our 6 species mix, and we have also a 12 species mix, which is more complex and contains more species, particularly more herbs. These swards are being co-grazed with cattle and sheep. And again, what we see is that when we look at the impact of sward type on lamb average daily gain from birth to slaughter, we see that lambs grazing multi-species swards had a 24% higher average daily gain than animals grazing either a perennial ryegrass monoculture or an old permanent pasture, which has been present on the site in Doubt for the last, probably 40 to 50 years. Similarly, when we investigate the effect of these multi-species swards on the performance of heifers, and again, in this case, these are a combination of Hereford and Angus heifers from the dairy herd. We see that the animals grazing our multi-species sward, the 6 species multi-species sward, I should say, had a 13% higher average daily gain than the animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass or the old permanent pasture. Interestingly, the animals grazing the 12 species mixture when it came to cattle didn't have an enhanced average daily gain performance compared to the permanent pasture or the perennial ryegrass sward. So it seemed, for the cattle at least, there was no benefit to going to a 12 species mixture compared to a 6 species mixture. And then Kate McCarthy and Finbar Mulligan at Lyons are currently involved in some grazing work with dairy cows. They're just commencing this week an actual in situ grazing study looking at perennial ryegrass and white clover and a multi-species sward. But now I'm going to present to you some results of a zero graze study they conducted with mid-lactation cows during last season's grazing season. So again, if we follow our colours, red being perennial ryegrass, yellow being perennial ryegrass, white clover, and green being a multi-species sward, we can see that with these mid-lactation dairy cows offered zero graze forage, they actually had a higher forage dry matter intake when they were offered perennial ryegrass and white clover or a multi-species sward compared to perennial ryegrass only. And this is often a challenge in our dairy systems to actually get enough intake into our cows. Now, granted, these were mid-lactation cows where it's probably less of a challenge, and we need to look at this response with our early lactation cows where intake tends to be a much greater challenge. Moving on to look at milk yield, and again, when we look at the effect of sward type on energy corrected milk yield, the mid-lactation dairy cows offered zero graze forage from the multi-species sward had a higher intake compared to animals offered either a perennial ryegrass only or a perennial ryegrass and white clover sward. And then the final slide I'll present from Kate's results would show that the fat and protein combined yield or milk solids yield again was higher when these animals were being fed a multi-species sward compared to either a perennial ryegrass monoculture or a perennial ryegrass white clover sward. So these results are positive for the dairy scenario, I think, and we are repeating them with animals actually grazing in situ, and there's a lot more work currently ongoing and planned in that regard. So to sum up then Mary, I think, we're all aware and perhaps acutely aware in terms of some of the commentary in the last week to 10 days that Irish and global agriculture is faced with several challenges. What I'm really confident in saying now at this stage is that when we offer animal swards consisting more than a single species, animal performance improves, and this is aligned with results from New Zealand, from continental Europe, from various studies we've conducted in Ireland, from Philip Cretan and Eastham Grain's work in Athenry and right around the country. We do need to develop detailed management blueprints in terms of how best to establish these swards, how to graze the swards, and how to maintain particularly the herbs in these multi-species swards. We also need to measure the direct environmental impacts of animals grazing these swards in terms of nitrogen and methane emissions, and that work is ongoing and planned in Lyons, in Johnstown Castle, in Athenry, in Moore Park, and in Doubt as well. And I think that, the reaction we're getting to the multi-species sward since we started working in this area, particularly on the animal performance side, are as interesting as the actual results themselves. It's important that we don't just view multi-species swards as a silver bullet solution that's going to solve all our problems, but they will form part of a toolbox of solutions, I think, for Irish farmers into the future. And with that, I would just like to acknowledge our funders and our collaborating institutions and our industry supporters who have funded us in UCD in this work, and it wouldn't be possible without their collaboration and without their support. And I'll attempt to answer any questions that may arise. Thanks, Mary. You're on mute there, Mary.
Thanks very much, Tommy, for a very interesting and informative presentation on the results from the animal performance trials at UCD. So look, we're going to open the floor now to questions, and there's a good few questions after coming in through the Q&A section there. So if anyone has questions, please put them in. But I'm going to bring at this point, bring John, Helen and Tommy in, and we'll start the questions and answer section, and hopefully we'll get through as many as we possibly can here this afternoon. So first question for you, Helen. What was the soil? This is a question coming from Paddy. What was the soil fertility under your trial in terms of your pH, P and K? And what's your advice, I suppose, in terms of the optimum soil status for sowing multi-species swards?
Okay, well, I guess to say that while we can reduce the nitrogen inputs by legume inclusion within the swards, we can't we have to ensure that other nutrients are not limiting within the soil. So, I mean, we need to ensure that our P's and K's are okay, you know, that they're up at index 3. And it's where we'd be targeting them, and also that our pH is appropriate for our legume content there. So, you know, you can't be, legumes are not going to perform particularly well in acidic conditions. So you need to be addressing that. So, I mean, these kind of multi-species swards that we're talking about here, they need to have good fertility and good soil health conditions in order to perform well. They're not the kind of thing that you put into the bottoms of your farm and hope that you know, you're going to get something out of that. They're not going to do well there. You really need to have good conditions, like you would be planning to sow a perennial ryegrass sward into. They're really not for marginal areas.
Okay, very good. There's a couple of questions coming in around you know, nitrogen saving, and I suppose the environmental benefit side of things from reduced nitrogen growth. So the question here, and I might direct this to you, Tommy, do you know how much money farmers can save from using these swards? And I suppose that's coming from the reduced nitrogen input. Or I suppose, will they save money in terms of fertilizer and also animal remedies? And how will that possibly, you know, and I suppose balance that then against maybe having to renew your multi-species swards a little bit more frequently?
Yeah, that's really the nub of the issue, Mary, to be very honest with you. And I'm going to provide an unsatisfactory answer in saying that we're currently, you know, doing those sums and doing those calculations. We're in the infancy with this research really in our beef systems. We only have 1 year complete, and we have another 2 years to complete. We're currently modeling the results from the sheep production systems. You know, you make savings in terms of your nitrogen, you make savings in terms of your anthelmintic inputs. There's potential actually to make savings in terms of your concentrate inputs that we're starting to see coming through from our beef production systems. And, you know, we can apply a euro value to all those costs. Obviously, reseeding is a large cost in the system. And, you know, all our data would indicate this to date that the herbs in particular don't persist in a sward to the same extent that, say, a perennial ryegrass or even a white clover will persist into the sward. So we do need to weigh up the benefit that we see from the reduced inputs versus the requirement to potentially reseed more frequently. And I think that the next step in our work is, you know, how can we reintroduce herbs into these swards without having to go for a full reseed again? Because it simply won't be possible for various reasons, or it wouldn't be advisable for various reasons of reseeding every 3 or 4 or 5 years perhaps with these multi-species swards. Back at the envelope calculations, which are always dodgy, and I'm very conscious of the little red dot up the top left-hand corner telling me this is being recorded when I say this, would suggest that the economic benefits are positive. But we have to do the full modelling analysis on that. I also think it's important, and both John and Helen can speak much more expertly about this than I, but the various other benefits that we're seeing from multi-species swards, where we can't actually attach a euro value just at the moment, they also need to be considered in terms of things like the value coming from the increased earthworm populations, the increased biodiversity, the increased water infiltration, the reduced nitrous oxide emissions, the reduced days to slaughter for our livestock. You know, there's a whole range of benefits here that we currently don't attach a euro value to, but I think more and more we will have to consider those in terms of the total outputs from the system. So I suppose I could have said, Mary, I don't actually know is the answer at the moment, but it's not just quite that simple.
Okay. John, do you want to add anything there, or you're happy enough?
No, that's a good response. Yeah, it reflects our position as well, that I think we need a fuller life cycle approach to looking at the systems and the costs to really say for sure. Like Tommy, you know, back of the envelope says it looks likely that it's positive. Probably the real positives are the environmental benefits that are going to become a much more pressing policy issue in the very near future.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions coming in now about getting them established. So I suppose, has there any research being done looking at different establishment methods of multi-species in the first place? And following on from that, I suppose a question there as well on over-sunning into existing swards, and Tommy, you kind of alluded to that, but maybe we just go into that a little bit more detail. And the advice in terms of the sowing rate. So if we take those three questions together, John, I might let you take those, please.
Sorry, sorry, Mary, can you, I should have kept a note of the three of them, pardon me. So was establishment?
Establishing multi-species.
So the establishment, in our experiments, of course, we want to get great establishment so that we're testing, we're not fighting with poor establishment as one of the confounding factors in an experiment. So we always do herbicide spray off of the existing sward, plow and reseed. So as normal, you know, as most farmers would do for any sward. So that is fine for experimental purposes. Look into the future, and especially if there, again, the environmental issues about ploughing are going to become more important in time with carbon sequestration issues. We are starting to look at oversowing. We're starting to look at stitching in methods, but it's just too early to say. I'm not aware, I think I said as I said in the chat, I'm not aware of published research on that myself at the minute for multi-species. I have absolutely no doubt in the world that there's groups of farmers doing it out there, and there's probably a real opportunity there to learn from either individual farmers and try and collate their experiences with the different types of oversowing and adaptive management for multi-species, as well as maybe EIP groups that are across Europe that may be doing this. I've no doubt that somebody's doing it, but it's not appearing in the published literature.
Okay. And are any of you analysing the mineral concentration and forage quality of the different sward mixtures? So, Tommy or Helen?
Yeah, we are looking at that, Mary, and you know, I suppose some of the differences we've been seeing in terms of the sort of traditional quality indicators, they look modest enough. You know, at certain parts of the year we will see higher crude protein contents in the multi-species swards, but that tends not to be a major issue with our perennial ryegrass sward. If anything, you know, sometimes we might like to have a lower crude protein in our perennial ryegrass swards. Particularly in the second half of the year, however, what we are seeing is a slightly reduced, or you know, a significantly reduced NDF, or a significantly reduced fiber content in our multi-species swards, and that means the animals are able to yield or harvest more energy from the sward. And you know, anyone who's familiar with grazing perennial ryegrass swards, it's one of the battles with a perennial ryegrass sward that it sometimes will lose some of its energy value coming into the second half of the season, particularly if it's not managed very, very carefully. In terms of the trace element or the mineral analysis, yes, there is work ongoing now on that at the moment. We have some kind of intermittent analysis of the animals grazing the swards rather than of the sward themselves, which would indicate that, you know, lambs grazing multi-species swards have better indicators of iodine and selenium status compared to animals grazing perennial ryegrass swards. But it's incredibly expensive analysis to do, so we're trying to be really targeted in terms of what swards we look at. Data from other research projects in the UK in particular would indicate that there is a higher mineral concentration in the herbs in particular, and the deeper rooting herbs, because they're able to essentially get down further into the sward horizon and draw up some of those nutrients from further down the sward profile.
And Tommy, is some of that having a benefit in terms of the animal performance, or where do you think we're really seeing the improvement in animal performance coming from the multi-species mixtures?
Well, Mary, if I had to answer that question now, I wouldn't have any research to do for the next 10 years fully. Certainly, you know, in terms of mineral status, where there's mineral deficiency issues in livestock, and we correct those mineral deficiency issues, let it be through an increased concentration of minerals in the sward or through some type of supplementation, then that will enhance animal performance. You know, I think it's coming from, you know, an increased energy intake. That tends to be probably our biggest challenge in our production, in our pasture-based production systems, is getting enough energy into our animals to support their growth. So it's probably more digestible swards and a higher intake overall, which is yielding to the animals consuming more in a day. And if we look at our sward disappearance data from our animal grazing studies with our beef cattle, the animals grazing the multi-species swards appear to be eating more over the course of the season than the animals grazing a ryegrass or a ryegrass white clover sward, which means they're getting more energy into them, and that appears to be what's driving their performance.
Okay. A question from Darren for you, John, here. It was interesting that the weeds of the multi-species were only at 4%. Just wondering about the market reduction of clover-safe pesticides. We have clover-safe pesticides available there for this year, which has been granted emergency use, of course. But going forward, do you see an issue with a weed issue with multi-species mixtures?
Yeah, so I think this is for farmers on the ground. There's two issues. There's persistency and weeds. These are the two most common questions that we get about the multi-species. So dealing with the weeds issue, my advice would be, if you've got a weed problem in a field, you have to deal with it before you sow the multi-species mixtures in. You know, I know farmers who are spraying allowing this existing seedbed to come through again and then respraying to get a stale seedbed before they put in the multi-species sward. Even with the clover safe sprays, if you've got herbs such as the chicory, plantain, salad burnet, you know, some of the more funky ones in your mix, you can't use a clover safe spray with those. So our advice is that you have to address any weed issues in your field before you sow. You can, of course, if you've got a few, you know, a patch of spear thistle or thistles or docks, I mean, you can spot spray. But my advice would be you have to deal with the weed problem before you sow.
Yeah.
That said, once you get good establishment, all of the data across multiple experiments everywhere says when you get good establishment, they are very, very good at suppressing weeds.
And just following on from that, John, and it was a question that came in yesterday through the ASA, at different zone rates of multi-species, have you done any work to look at different zone rates and the effect on weeds, or are you just seeing that, you know, once you have well-established multi-species in terms of a legume, a herb and a grass proportion, that regardless of the zone rate of them, you're seeing a good ability for them to suppress weeds?
Exactly that. We haven't done a lot of work on that, but that first experiment across the European project that I mentioned across the 31 sites, that had 2 sowing densities, and it had no effect on weed establishment. Once you got good establishment of the mixtures, they suppressed the weeds. And going at 60% of the normal sowing rate had no significant effect on weed establishment. So once you get good establishment, they are good at keeping the weeds out.
Okay. Helen, a question here for you. How can we best manage multi-species swards to maximize the benefits for biodiversity and wildlife?
I guess, you know, we have to remember these are not species-rich grasslands, and they're not semi-natural grasslands, and they will not, you know, they should never be regarded as such in terms of wider biodiversity and what they can support. But I guess when we look at them in comparison to a perennial ryegrass monoculture, there appear to be benefits there. So, I mean, you know, we are, I suppose, limited in that they're going to be grazed regularly, or they're going to be cut for silage, and all of that vegetation removal, those, you know, limit the diversity of invertebrates that will be associated with them. But where we have a little bit of flowering going on at the edges, for example, or you know, if there is anything left post grazing, that can be hugely beneficial. But I think, you know, the below ground biodiversity in terms of the earthworms certainly seems to be hugely important, hugely functionally important for farmers, and the legume content of the swards really seems to be driving that.
Have you any explanation for that, Helen?
It's I need to get Olaf Schmidt in here to run that one by him, but they seem to really like legumes and the swards in terms of the legume roots, and their ability to feed there is enhanced with having the legumes present.
Okay, thanks.
I just come back to the question on the establishment methods, if you don't mind, Mary. We are doing some work on that on the Devonish lands at Doubt. So Jane Shackleson's PhD, we're looking at a direct drill versus a conventional kind of plough till, so plot scale. And so far, I think it's safe to say that we haven't found any difference in terms of establishment from the 2 methods. But I mean, care does need to be taken in terms of what you're putting into your mix, and the seed size, and also the depth you're going to with your direct drill.
Okay, very good. Is there any measurement going on of soil carbon sequestration with multi-species swards?
There are measures, yes. I think it's fair to say we're certainly taking ones at Lions, but soil carbon is notoriously slow process to record and see changes in. So that's one of the reasons we feel we need a long-term platform dedicated to measuring, I suppose, environmental issues such as that, which really fall, you can't get a handle on them really within the confines of a kind of conventional 4 or 5 year project. We need a longer time commitment to taking measurements like that. So I think it's going to be further down the road before we can say anything definite on that. But you know, you would expect with deeper roots, etc., that we would see some benefits there.
Okay. There's a couple of questions coming in terms of producing silage off multi-species swards. So, you know, what's the best practice advice for silage production? And I suppose, does it work, or are they more suited to grazing as grazing swards?
You want to come in? Well, just to start it off, and maybe the others will follow up. Thomas Maloney's PhD looked at that, and what Thomas found was certainly that you can produce as good a quality silage from a multi-species sward as a good ryegrass silage, but I suppose the conditions that are required to produce it are more challenging. So you need to get that good wilt beforehand, so a higher moisture content in them. If you don't get a good wilt on the sward before it's baled up or pitted, you're going to run into difficulties. So it's more challenging, and you need the weather conditions to be able to get a good silage from them.
Tommy, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, Mary, I think when on our system so far, we've been making bale silage with these swards, and we've been drying them, you know, for maybe 36 to 48 hours in good drying conditions. And when we do that, you know, we make good silage. Last year we were limited in the work we could do in our own laboratory in terms of testing the quality of our silage. So we outsourced the testing to a commercial laboratory, and I don't for a second doubt that the results we got back were accurate. But when using NIR to measure the quality of the silages, I think it's underestimating the quality of our multi-species silage. When we fed those multi-species silages to our calves, they grew to 100 grams per day faster than the calves consuming good quality grass silage. So I think when we can produce them well, we can make very good, highly nutritious silage from our multi-species swards. I think the window in the year for making silage from multi-species swards, particularly where there's a high herb content in the sward, it's a lot narrower. We really need to be doing it in May and June, where you have very long day length and a lot of hours of drying. We produced some silage off these swards one year in late August, early September, and we just couldn't get it dry enough, and you know, it didn't go well. So I think when it's good, it's very, very good, but when it's bad, it's horrid. It would have sum up the making of silage on the multi-species swards.
Very good. Just a question probably, and I might put this to yourself, Tommy, and to John as well. What's your view on the best mixture in terms of what's the optimum multi-species mixture that someone who should be sowing, in your view?
I don't know what the optimum is. John and Helen will be better able to answer that question. Our best results have come with the 6 species mixture to date, Mary, but we're also looking at 5 species mixtures. You know, certainly with the 6 species mixture in any of the trials we have conducted, it has given animal performance benefits compared to our ryegrass monocultures. But I can't say from my work with grazing animals in these swards that a 6 species is better than a 3 or a 4, because we haven't actually tested that. But I think John and Helen can comment more sensibly on that from an environmental and an agronomic perspective.
Helen, do you want to come in?
I guess just to say that, yes, we've been getting our best results from our 6 species mix so far. If you're including more species in the mixture, I think there really isn't any point in doing so unless you're going to manage that sward for within the kind of requirements of the most finicky species that you're including, if you like, you know. So you've got to manage for the species that you're putting in there, or else they're not going to last in the sward. So it's really, I suppose, what your system requires you to do as well is you have to take that into account when devising an appropriate mix for your site or for your farm.
Thanks, Helen. John, have you anything to add to that? Are you happy?
Yeah, again, you know, we started off looking at 4 species mixes that were grass and legume only. Then we started looking at a 4 species mix, which was grass, legume, and 1 herb. And we found more improvements over time. And now we're looking at 6 species and we're finding more improvements. If you were to ask me to put my money on it, I would say I don't think that we can include many more species and continue to see. I think we're plateauing for these intensively managed systems. We're plateauing at probably 6 to 8 species. I'd like to test it before making that conclusion. The question was more about the percentage contribution. So I might return to that for a second, because our latest work has been doing that. And we see that as a very important question that we are starting a new PhD student on in this September, October. What are the best percentages of grasses, legumes, and herbs? And a real scientist response to that is, well, best at what? Because you've got multiple functions that you're interested in. You're interested in yield, weed suppression, increasingly animal production, of course, increasingly other important issues like nitrogen replacement value, carbon sequestration, reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. And I think consistently we're finding that probably that sweet spot across multiples of those kinds of functions is that 1/3 of each group. Now, I don't think our experiments are fine-tuned enough to say plus or minus 5%, but broadly, and you can see it from some of the graphs I showed earlier, those colored plots, that, you know, somewhere in and around that 1/3 of each group seems to be performing well across multiples. Could we improve that? Probably, but at the same time, when you sow these things, and it is one of the issues, is that when you sow a particular mix, you could sow it in 10 different fields and you'll get a slightly different percentage from each field. So maybe we shouldn't worry too much about getting down to the closest 5%, because there's an element of responding to the local weather, soil conditions, soil moisture, soil fertility as well when you actually sow them. But so just to finish it off, I mean, it seems at the moment that if you are interested in multiple functions that are important for grassland systems and not just yield, even though it works for yield as well, they're all converging on that sweet spot somewhere in the middle.
And just on that, John, have you kind of, for someone who's thinking of sowing, have you a recommendation in terms of what sowing rate they should have of the clovers, of the herbs, and of the grass in terms of that initial sward? Because I mean, at the end of the day, getting the percentages in the established sward, you know, it's difficult. But if we know where to start, I suppose, when you're sowing them.
I don't have I can't say something like it's 15. If you're looking for a value like 15 kgs per hectare of seed, because we measure out all of the seeds individually for our fields, because we're aiming for a certain percentages. So I just can't give a value like that. Sorry.
Okay. Tommy, do you want to add anything? Have you anything to say on the sowing rates?
Nothing really to go over and above what John has said, Mary. We've tried different sowing rates in different studies, but we haven't compared them within an individual study. I know Philip Cretan and Lisa McGrain in Athenry are doing a lot of really detailed work now, looking at different sowing rates of grasses, legumes, and herbs, and the combination of diploid and tetraploid perennial ryegrass varieties. But you know, I can't say any more than what John has said there in terms of recommendations. We've gone between packs of kind of 12 to 15 kilos per acre, and in some cases we've gone very high, or you know, in my opinion, you know, very high with the herb inclusion rates. You know, about 1.8, 1.9 kilos per acre of herbs. And I suppose if somebody was going to sow a multi-species sward and are interested in having herbs in the mixture, I would be pushing up towards that sort of level in the seed mixture, because particularly with something like chicory, the most chicory you get in the sward is the day it germinates. So if it's not there initially, it won't be there afterwards.
Okay. Just Tommy, another question, and you alluded to at the end of your presentation that, you know, we still have a lot to learn about grazing management for these multi-species, but there are a number of questions coming in. So could you just kind of give a bit of an overview in terms of best practice management, in terms of what covers we should be going into on the multi-species, how we integrate animals in where maybe we only want to have 1 or 2 fields of multi-species on the farm, and I suppose what we should be grazing our multi-species swards down to as well? Yeah,
well, I won't be able to give you best management, Mary. I'll be able to tell you what we do, and you know, can respond to that in whatever fashion they wish. In our first study with the sheep, we grazed all our swards to 4 centimeters post-grazing sward height, our ryegrass or ryegrass white clover and our multi-species sward. And we had the same rotation interval across all treatments, and we had the same pre-grazing harvest mass, which was targeting 12 to 1400 kilos of dry matter per hectare. And the multi-species sward and the animals grazing the multi-species swards performed well in that. But the herbs, they disappeared out of the sward quite rapidly, particularly something like chicory. When chicory is grazed, it regrows, utilizing its root reserve. And if we're frequently depleting the chicory, that root reserve will diminish quite quickly, and it'll just disappear out of the sward. In our beef cattle production systems now, what we're doing is we're grazing the swards to a 6 centimeter post-grazing sward height. And we're going into slightly higher covers of about 14 to 1500 kilos of dry matter per hectare as a pre-grazing herbage mass. And that's promoting the animal performance results we have seen to date. I think in terms of animals going into these swards once and infrequently in a rotation, I think your dairy cows where you're going to have your biggest concern. And we even see this with cows grazing clover swards with quite a lot of clover in the sward. We need to be careful that the animals are not going in and selectively grazing the clover out of the sward or the clover and the herb out of the sward. So you might need to look at something like setting up a hot wire or a break fence in those swards when the cows are coming out of the parlour to give them a 2 or 3 hour break and then let them across the entire daily allocation to minimise that risk of bloat. I wouldn't be getting, at this stage, based on the evidence we have, I wouldn't be getting hugely concerned about the fact that, animals might be hitting a multi-species sward 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 paddocks. I think that the rumen microbiome will be reasonably well, or the bugs in the rumen will be reasonably well adapted to deal with the type of nutrients that they're getting from the sward. So other than the need for caution in relation to bloat with any high legume sward, I think that would be where my concern would rest and end.
Okay. And just there's a question from obviously a young farmer here who's reseeding this year at home, and he's very interested in trying some multi-species mixtures. But he wants to convince his father not to buy an off-the-shelf perennial ryegrass mixture. So what support or advice is available to farmers like him who want to try take a first step into the multi-species in terms of when they're seeding this year?
Talk to your local friendly seed rep, Mary, I would say. I think a 6 species mix is a good starting point to go with something like that, and obviously yourselves and there are other seed providers available as well. Are supplying a lot of these mixtures out there. In terms of convincing your father, from bitter experience, you'll never be a prophet in your own land. So that might be the bigger challenge than getting the seed mixture, which is soon. But I think a 6-way mix, 2 grasses, 2 legumes, 2 herbs will be a pretty safe starting point. Yeah, we know a lot about grazing those mixtures and how to grow and how to perform.
John, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I know very well the feeling of putting my father's money where my mouth is. We've taken my father has taken the bait at home as well, and is putting in quite a bit of them at the minute. I think that it's a good question about support and advice, and to be fair, we probably have a catch-up job to do in our advisory support to make sure the farmers who want support about multi-species mixtures can get it. But we're working on it.
Okay. Look, we ran a little bit over time. We might take 1 or 2 more questions before we wrap up the session. There's a lot of questions after coming in, and I think we've answered a lot, but there's still a few more that we might try answer before we finish up. So another question for you, Tommy, here. Were you not surprised to see an increase in terms of production with the white clover ryegrass swards?
Sorry, Mary, you just broke up there. Could you say that to me again, please?
Sorry, were you not surprised to see increased production in the white clover ryegrass sward?
Was I not surprised to see an increase in production in the white clover ryegrass sward? Which I'm not quite sure what that relates to. With many of our studies, we did see improvements in performance with the ryegrass white clover sward compared to perennial ryegrass monoculture. We're seeing it in our beef systems. We saw increases in our sheep production systems. I think maybe the one where we didn't see a benefit with the ryegrass white clover sward compared to the ryegrass monoculture was in our zero graze dairy production study. And listen, we always need to be careful with the interpretation and extrapolation of zero graze results. You know, zero grazing offers a lot of benefits from a research perspective and from a farming perspective, but one of the things it does in terms of the animal perspective, it removes an element of choice from the animal in terms of what they graze, because they'll have a finite amount of grass in front of them in the shed to graze. So potentially what we're seeing there is that the animals grazing the white clover ryegrass sward in the field could select for more white clover in their diet compared to ryegrass, but when they're zero grazed, they don't have that option of selection in the same extent, and that's potentially the explanation there.
And just to follow on from your answer there, Tommy, with multi-species swards, have you seen animals selectively grazing, I suppose, some of the herbs maybe first? And you know, how do we deal with that if they're selecting something and leaving something else behind?
Yeah, and listen, the longer they're in a paddock, you know, the more selecting they will do. And certainly going back to our sheep, and sheep would be the most selective of our grazers. You know, you turn your sheep into a sward in the morning, and it might look like a plantain-dominated sward, and you come back that evening, and the plantain is gone from it. So, you know, sheep do have the potential to select. It's very difficult to manage it, Mary, in a lot of ways. You know, it's probably easier in dairy systems because you'll be given a 12 or a 24-hour break, and your cows will be consuming everything on offer in the paddock in that 12 or 24-hour break. When you're in beef production systems or sheep production systems, you know, once a week, once every 10 days maybe, and it's almost an unavoidable consequence of that of that type of grazing management. You know, and again, I suppose from an animal performance point of view and animal health point of view, the concern is that, you know, is there a risk of bloat if an animal goes into a legume-rich sward and it selects a lot of legume? We haven't recorded any instances of bloat in our beef grazing systems or in our sheep grazing systems to date, and it's more of an issue at in dairy systems at farm level, and that work is starting next week, so we'll be able to report more on that in the coming weeks and months.
Perfect. And just to clarify as well, Tommy, in terms of the lamb dosing intervals, was it determined by a particular cutoff on fecal egg count?
Yeah, good question, Mary, and I should have said that in the presentation. We were looking at a fecal egg count on a treatment basis of 400 eggs per gram. So we were individually sampling every lamb on every treatment, and then we calculated the average parasite burden. And once that hit 400 eggs per gram on a treatment basis, we dosed that treatment only. So that was the trigger for dosing. So the lambs on the ryegrass were getting back to that threshold more quickly than the lambs on the multi-species sward.
Okay. And as a final question, and I'm going to ask you all to answer this question. So every point and what you've discussed today has weighed very positively towards multi-species mixtures. Are there any weaknesses in them as you see it? And what are the main ones? So John, I might go to you first on that question, please. If there's no weaknesses, just say it.
No, I think out of fairness, we have to point the weaknesses. So I'll just maybe quickly point the weaknesses, which we've already mentioned. It's the need to get the weed control right at establishment, the persistency issue, and I think if you can deal with those, we've got it cracked. The other point I'll make is that I guess the other issue is that this is new. You know, if you think about the current blueprint that we have for grazing systems, it's the culmination of a remarkable legacy of scientific application over the last 20 to 30 and maybe even 40 years. And it's now at the pinnacle of that. I think right now you're just seeing an absolute barest fraction of that effort having been applied to the multi-species system. So that's why we're still learning to get there. And I think we've made remarkable achievements in it, even in the last 4 to 5 years alone. Thank you.
Okay. Tommy, I might ask you to come in next.
Yeah, and listen, I fully echo what John has said in terms of the novelty of this research and the newness of it. And you know, there was a question popped up in the chat there. Basically, does this mean the progress in perennial ryegrass breeding over the last 15 years has been for nothing? And absolutely not. There was fantastic progress made in perennial ryegrass breeding, and the progress from where perennial ryegrass was as a species and was as a farmed plant 60, 70 years ago has been incredible, and huge credit to everybody there. But that progress was made in a particular policy context, and in a particular context where, you know, chemical nitrogen was cheap, relatively freely available, and could be freely applied. And we're transiting out of that environment and out of that policy scenario now. So it's not to say that ryegrass was bad. It was fantastic, but we're in a slightly different set of circumstances now. So that's the first thing I'd say. Are there challenges, Mary? There are absolutely challenges. There are challenges in terms of the establishment of the swards. There are challenges in terms of the maintenance of the swards. And there are challenges in terms of perceptions to the swards. And I kind of indicated at the end of my presentation that the response to the sward, to this work has been as exciting and as varied as the results we're getting from the work. And for some people, you know, the whole country should be in multi-species swards in the morning, and it's the only way to go. For others, you know, we're telling farmers to plough up good perennial ryegrass swards and plant weeds behind them, and it's completely the wrong way to go. And, you know, for others, we haven't gone far enough in terms of the complexity of our multi-species mixture. So attitudinal change is a huge challenge. I'm not necessarily saying it's a deficiency, but it's a huge challenge. And we as researchers need to come up with the research results to support the uptake of these technologies at the farm level. It is new technology. The advisory services who again do fantastic work, they need to be brought up to speed in terms of the knowledge base to be able to advise farmers. You know, and farmers, they're the ones who are putting their hands in their pockets to plant these swards on their farms. So they need to be confident that they're going to give an economic return. And that's a deficiency we have at the moment. We don't have the data ready to roll out at farm level to say there is an economic return or not of including these swards. And the economic return comes back to successfully establishing them and maintaining them within the sward.
Very good. Thanks, Tommy. And just Helen, I'll just give you the final say on this, you know, weaknesses in terms of multi-species as you see them. But I suppose without we need to emphasize there's a huge number of positives with them as well.
Yeah, and I guess we have touched on them already, but Tommy and John have also mentioned them there, you know, the establishment, the persistence of the species, and I guess the challenge around silage production and how you incorporate them into your system as a consequence of that. We do know, as I said, that they're not going to produce good silage if you don't get good conditions for them. So that, you know, you're limited perhaps in terms of when you can produce good silage from them. But they have the potential to do it. I suppose there are huge benefits that we're discovering associated with these. In terms of management of them, I mean, we've had, as John and Tommy have said, we've had 40, 50 years of research on ryegrass, fantastic research, and the management of those swards has been well tied down at this stage. Yes, we're still learning, but a lot is known. If you cut it to this height or graze it to that height, you will get this performance and you put down this amount of nitrogen. We have a lot to learn with the multi-species. And indeed, we may never get to a point where we can be as prescriptive because, you know, you're dealing with a mix of species and those will interact and interact with each other and the local environment, as well as the management that's ongoing at a local basis. So, you know, there's going to be, I think, more need for farmer involvement and observation in terms of learning from their experience over the years, what works and what doesn't work on their site, as well as what works for others in the locality. And I think, you know, that's something that farmers are going to have to take on themselves, that, you know, we'll be able to provide certain information over time, but there will be a degree of their own experience being really important in determining management prescriptions for these swards as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a hugely valuable point, Helen, insofar as, you know, we are seeing farmers really, you know, willing to sow multi-species on their farms now. You know, there's, I suppose, we know a huge amount more on multi-species, I'd say, now compared to what we knew 5 years ago, compared to what we knew 10 years ago. And obviously, you know, we do have a lot more to learn. But, you know, farmers are at the point now where a lot of them are willing to try these, to see what works in their own farm. And I suppose, you know, that's going to be important going forward, combined with, I suppose, the work that's ongoing with yourselves and your colleagues, of course. And I think, you know, it's a hugely important space. And, you know, I think we'll all watch with interest on the developments that come out of Johnstown Castle and Chagas research, and also from UCD over the next couple of years, because, you know, I think, you know, the amount we're all learning at the moment is massive on the multi-species. So with that, I just want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Dr. John Finn, Dr. Helen Sheridan and Professor Tommy Boland. I think we've had a hugely informative session here in terms of the three presentations, hugely valuable in terms of the information that was presented and in order to increase our understanding of multi-species. We went through most of the questions. Hopefully we've got all of them answered. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Anne-Marie Butler, who will close the session. And thanks to everyone watching this afternoon for participating and putting questions in.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. And again, to thank our speakers for an excellent session, an excellent summation there by Mary. So thank you very much to everyone. And I think great advice makes a difference. Is very timely when we look at the excellent information and knowledge that we had there today across all our speakers, and very ably and capably chaired by Mary from Germany. So to thank her sincerely and to thank Germany and Ireland for their sponsorship of this event, we very much appreciate. I did attend a Teagasc event yesterday where Professor Luke O'Neill spoke, and I was reminded of some of his words there earlier, where he spoke about base what you say on data. And I think today's event has been very much to the core of that, the tremendous knowledge that is available, the tremendous science in action right across the country and right across all the research agencies, and the power of data and how that data will further offer insight and value to the next research steps. And as we get that research onto farm, and many of the questions that came in the Q&A on the relevance in grazing situations and on farm, and the financial situation, and looking at how we balance that with all the challenges that are there. I think more than ever, science and our agri-scientists are at the core of shaping the sector for the future, rising to the challenges and basing all of our information and decisions on that data validation and the people who are to the fore. And they were certainly here today. So again, a final thank you to John, Helen, Tommy, and to Mary. Again, thank you to Barbara at base and for the production of the videos, but most importantly to everyone who joined us. We had tremendous numbers. Thank you for joining. As you heard, the event is recorded, so it will be up on the ASA website over the coming days. So feel free to go back and I suppose appreciate those slides again and take the information with you. So from me, Anne-Marie Butler, ASA President, to thank everybody. Again, we look forward to seeing you all again soon, and have a lovely afternoon.